Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Today I want to share with you some of the things that I have learned researching a new book about the history of Arlington National Cemetery and other historic cemeteries here in Northern Virginia. Now, the history of Arlington National Cemetery is really fascinating. It was created as a military cemetery during the Civil War to accommodate Union dead. Private William Henry Chrisman from Pennsylvania was the first soldier to be buried at Arlington. A laborer, Chrisman enlisted in the United States Army on March the 25th, 1864. He was hospitalized for measles 5 weeks later and died on May the 11th without ever having fired a shot. He was buried on May the 13th, 1864. By the end of the Civil War, there were some 16,000 burials at Arlington. But let's start at the beginning. Arlington started as a private estate. George Washington Parke Custis inherited 1,100 acres overlooking the Potomac River when his father, the stepson of General George Washington, died. Custis made his home here at the estate he called Arlington House. He had one daughter, Mary, and Mary Custis fell in love with a penniless soldier named Robert E. Lee. In 1857, George Washington Parke Custis died, and Mary and Robert E. Lee moved into and lived in Arlington House until 1861. When Virginia seceded, Lee joined the Confederate Army. Union troops moved into Virginia in May 1861 and took up positions around Arlington House. The property was confiscated when property was taxed and the taxes not paid by Mrs. Lee in person. The property was purchased by a tax commissioner for government use. Enter now Brigadier General Montgomery C. Meeks, commander of the garrison at Arlington House and Quartermaster General of the Union Army, who may have had a grudge against Robert E. Lee. Meeks was tasked with finding additional burying ground for battle casualties. Meeks and Lee had served together many years earlier as military engineers on the Mississippi River. Lee was a first lieutenant, and Meeks was his subordinate, a second lieutenant. Did Meeks bear Lee a personal grudge? Some historians think so. Or perhaps he was just embittered by the war itself or by Lee's defection from the Union Army. Meeks wrote to the Secretary of War stating that the grounds about the mansion are admirably suited to such a use, that is, burying soldiers. Meeks reported his grim satisfaction of ordering 26 Union dead to be buried near Mrs. Lee's rose garden in June 1864. Meeks had graves dug right up to the entrance to the house. Now, this was malicious. Meeks intended to prevent the Lee family from ever again inhabiting the house. As I said before, more than 16,000 Union soldiers were buried on the estate grounds. Ironically, Meeks's own son was sent to Arlington for burial. Neither Robert E. Lee nor his wife ever set foot in Arlington House again. Interestingly, in 1882, the U.S. Supreme Court returned the property to the Lee family, stating that it had been confiscated without due process. General Lee's son sold the house and land to the government for its fair market value, thereby avoiding a crisis where all of the bodies would have had to have been reburied elsewhere. Now, the first memorial constructed at Arlington National Cemetery was the Civil War Unknowns Monument, which was meant as a tribute to Union soldiers. Bodies of some 2,000 dead soldiers were collected within a 35-mile radius. Most were full or partial remains, discovered unburied and unidentifiable in an era when there were no dog tags or other identification or DNA testing. Because of the inability to identify remains, it is thought that some Confederate dead were also interred here. An inscription on the west face of the memorial describes the number of dead in the vault below. Originally, a Rodman gun was placed at each corner, and a pyramid of shot adorned the center of the lid. By 1893, the memorial had been redesigned. The plain walls had been embellished, and although the inscription had been retained, the lid was replaced by one modeled after the Ark of the Covenant. The Civil War Unknowns Monument was the inspiration for Montgomery Meigs's own tomb, also located at Arlington National Cemetery. Several hundred Confederate dead were buried at Arlington by the end of the war in April 1865. Some were prisoners of war who had died in custody, some were executed spies, and some were battlefield dead. But the federal government did not permit the decoration of Confederate graves. In 1868, families of dead Confederates were barred from the cemetery on Decoration Day, what we now know as Memorial Day. Union veterans prowled the cemetery, ensuring the Confederate graves were not honored in any way. Families of Confederates buried at Arlington were refused permission to lay flowers on their loved ones' graves. Now, here we have a picture that shows the graves of freed slaves. Freed slaves were given land by the government at freedmen's villages located on the estate. Here they farmed and lived during and after the Civil War. More than 3,800 former slaves, called contrabands during the war, are buried in Section 27. Their headstones are designated with the word civilian or citizen. Now, Arlington National Cemetery was segregated until 1948. Veterans of the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, were also buried in Section 27. The 175 regiments of the USCT made up some 10% of the Union Army. And after the Civil War, soldiers in the USCT fought in the Indian Wars in the American West. 30 years after the Civil War, the battleship Maine exploded in Cuba with large loss of life on February the 15th, 1898. This precipitated the Spanish-American War. The war lasted 10 weeks. A victorious United States emerged as a world power. During this war, 968 American soldiers were killed in combat, and over 5,000 died of disease. In 1900, the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America voted to place a memorial to the Spanish-American dead at Arlington National Cemetery. The monument was unveiled and dedicated on May the 21st, 1902, and was the first national memorial erected by a National Society of Women. Other monuments were to follow. The All-Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, organized by Theodore Roosevelt and known to history as the Rough Riders, gained fame for the charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. A Rough Riders National Monument Society was organized in 1906, and a memorial was dedicated in 1907. Construction on the main mast Memorial began in November 1913. The base of the mausoleum resembled a battleship gun turret. The mast of the main pierced the top of this structure and was the second floor of the structure. The main mast memorial was dedicated on May the 30th, 1915. Now, because of the Spanish-American War, the federal government changed its policy toward Confederate graves at Arlington. On December the 14th, 1898, President McKinley announced that the federal government would begin tending Confederate graves, since these dead represented a tribute to American valor. On June the 4th, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson dedicated the Confederate Memorial at Arlington. Several hundred Confederate dead were disinterred and reburied in a Confederate section around the spot designated for the Confederate Memorial. The Confederate Memorial was dedicated to reconciliation and the hope of a united future. U.S. presidents have traditionally sent a wreath to be placed at the Confederate Memorial on Memorial Day, and President Obama has kept up this tradition. Competition had been held to select the sculpture of the Confederate Memorial. Moses Ezekiel won the competition and entitled his work "The New South." The monument's focus is on peace and the future, and its repetitive images focus on the sacrifice made by the common soldier. The next chapter in Arlington's development came after World War I. America entered World War I on April the 6th, 1917. The arrival of fresh American troops was a tremendous morale boost to the war-weary British and French. The Americans arrived at the rate of 10,000 per day, tipping the strategic balance. The United States mobilized over 4 million military personnel and suffered 110,000 deaths during the war. Armistice Day, November the 11th, was established as a national day of remembrance, commemorating the armistice signed between the Allies and Germany on November the 11th, 1918, making the end of hostilities on the Western Front a possibility. The day was subsequently renamed Veterans Day on March the 4th, 1921. Congress approved the burial in 1921 of an unidentified American serviceman from World War I at Arlington National Cemetery. A highly decorated soldier, Sergeant Edward F. Younger, selected from 4 identical caskets. The chosen unknown was transported to the United States to be placed in the tomb of the unknown soldier. The World War I unknown lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda prior to burial at Arlington National Cemetery. And on Armistice Day, November the 11th, 1921, President Warren G. Harding presided over the interment ceremonies. Now, even in 1921, the intention had been to place a superstructure atop the tomb. But it was not until 5 years later that Congress authorized the necessary funds for completion of the tomb, which was completed in April 1932. In 1958, unknown American soldiers from World War II and the Korean War were interred with the unknown soldier of World War I. On August the 3rd, 1956, President Eisenhower signed a bill to select and pay tribute to the unknowns of World War II and the Korean War. The selection ceremonies took place in 1958. The World War II unknown was selected from remains exhumed from the cemeteries in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. The casket of the World War II and Korean War unknowns were interred beside their World War I comrade on May the 30th, 1958. The designation of the Vietnam unknown has proven to be difficult. With the improvements in DNA testing, it is possible that the remains of every soldier killed in the Vietnam War will, in fact, eventually be identified. The Tomb of the Unknowns, as it is now called, is one of Washington's most important patriotic sites. And since 1948, the tomb has been guarded by soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard. This regiment, organized in 1784, is the oldest active duty regiment in the United States Army. Part of the regiment's mission is to conduct memorial affairs to honor fallen comrades, including stand in full honor funerals at Arlington and dignified transfers of fallen soldiers returning to the United States. The Old Guard is the only unit in the U.S. Armed Forces authorized to march with fixed bayonets in all parades. Elements of the Old Guard serve special roles, including being sentinels at the Tomb of the Unknowns. It is considered a high honor to serve at the tomb. Few volunteers are accepted for training, and of those, only a small number pass the training necessary to become a full-fledged tomb guard. Over 400,000 American heroes are now buried at Arlington National Cemetery. One of the notables buried at Arlington is William Howard Taft, 1857 to 1930, the 27th President of the United States, and later the 10th Chief Justice of the United States. Taft is the only person to have served in both offices. Taft and John F. Kennedy are the only U.S. presidents buried at Arlington. Now, Taft is not only one of the 2 presidents buried at Arlington National Cemetery, he is also one of only 4 Chief Justices buried there. The others are Earl Warren, Warren Burger, and William Rehnquist. Taft was the first president to throw out the baseball at a season opener in a game between the Washington Senators and the Philadelphia Athletics in 1910. Taft's wife, Helen, who died in 1943, was instrumental in bringing Japanese cherry trees to Washington. Today, a 14-foot tall granite monument inspired by ancient Greek burial stelas marks the graves of Taft and his wife. Mrs. Taft arranged with James Earl Fraser, a New York sculptor, to design this private monument for the grave. The design was approved by the Commission of Fine Arts and the Secretary of War, and it was erected by the Taft family in early 1932. Another notable honored at Arlington National Cemetery is Major Archibald Butt, 1865-1912. Archibald Butt was the military aide to both Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Butt and his housemate, some say lover, the painter Francis Davis Millais, died during the sinking of the Titanic. Butt was universally recognized for his heroic conduct during the tragedy. His body was never recovered. President Taft, who had become very close to Major Butt and saw him as a son or a brother, praised him as a Christian gentleman and a perfect soldier. Taft wrote, "I knew that he would certainly remain on the ship's deck until every duty had been performed and every sacrifice made that properly fell on one charged, as he would feel himself charged with the responsibility for the rescue of others." At a May 5th ceremony, Taft broke down weeping, bringing his eulogy to an abrupt end. As the Titanic sank, the crew prepared the lifeboats, and Major Butt helped in the rescue efforts. One survivor described him as calm and collected. Major Butt helped frightened people so wonderfully, tenderly, and yet with such cool and manly firmness. He was a soldier to the last. A cenotape was erected in the summer of 1913 by the brothers of Archibald Butt. It's in Section 3, at a point that the Major had previously selected as his gravesite. The Butt-Millay Memorial Fountain, a private memorial fountain, which is located in the President's Park adjacent to the White House, was dedicated in October 1913. Powerful friends argue that Butt, who was an aide to the President, and Millay, who was a vice chair at the time of his death of the Fine Arts Commission, were both public servants who deserved to be memorialized separately from private citizens who died in the Titanic disaster. Now, another notable buried at Arlington is John J. Pershing. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, 1917 to 1918, insisting that American units not be put under British or French command as replacements, but that they fight as independent units under American command. Another hero buried at Arlington is Robert E. Peary, an American explorer who claimed to have reached the North Pole in 1909. Peary's claim was widely credited for most of the 20th century, but the first undisputed explorers did not reach the North Pole until 1969. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy paid tribute to Admiral Peary in 1929 on the 20th anniversary of the so-called discovery of the North Pole. Ceremonies were conducted at the grave of the explorer, but some historians believe that Peary was guilty of deliberately exaggerating his accomplishments. Also buried at Arlington is Richard E. Byrd, a pioneering American aviator and polar explorer who reached both the North and South Pole by air. By the time of his death, Byrd had received 9 citations for bravery, including the Medal of Honor. Omar Bradley is buried at Arlington. Bradley commanded all U.S. ground forces after the Normandy invasion in 1944. He commanded some 1.3 million men. Bradley is one of only 9 people to have ever held 5-star rank in the United States Armed Forces. Another notable is Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the first African American appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Marshall was a lawyer known for his high success rate in arguing before the Supreme Court and for his advocacy during the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, the decision that desegregated schools. Now, Marshall is remembered for having challenged the legal underpinning of racial segregation, the doctrine of separate but equal, established by the 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. On May the 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, and therefore racial segregation of public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Brown v. Board provided the legal foundation for the American Civil Rights Movement and established Marshall as one of the most prominent lawyers in American history. To learn more about historic cemeteries of Northern Virginia, visit our website at www.timetravel21.com or write us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. This show has been brought to you by a generous gift from the Margarita W. and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.